Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be jumping into some excerpts that you sent in from Richard Dawkins' book, The Extended Phenotype.
Yeah.
Specifically, Chapter 12, Good Companions.
Good stuff.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating look at how genes, collaborate and compete within a species. We're basically going to be looking at evolution from the perspective of the genes themselves.
It is a fascinating shift in thinking. Dawkins calls this the gene's eye view, and it really challenges us to see how genes, those tiny little units of heredity, actually experience the world through the bodies that they helped create.
Yeah, so instead of focusing on the organism, we're zooming in on the genes within it.
Yeah.
Almost like we're becoming microscopic explorers.
Exactly. Imagine genes as these tiny little travelers hopping from one generation to the next. Their success hinges on their ability to create a functional organism, a vehicle that allows them to survive and reproduce.
Right.
It makes you wonder, how do these genes, acting in their own self-interest, how do they manage to cooperate to build such complex organisms?
Yeah, that's the central question Dawkins explores in this chapter.
Yeah.
It seems paradoxical. How can something that's driven by self-interest also be cooperative?
Well, Dawkins argues that cooperation arises out of necessity. He uses the concept of a gene pool to illustrate this. Think of it as a giant mixing bowl filled with all the genes unique to a particular species.
So all the genes within a species are constantly being stirred and recombined to create unique individuals.
Precisely. And this mixing is restricted to members of the same species, those capable of interbreeding, as Ernst Mayr famously defined it.
Right.
Dawkins points out that even determining what constitutes a separate species can be tricky, especially when we look back at the fossil record.
Right.
For instance, Homo erectus and modern humans, Homo sapiens, are classified as separate species.
Right.
But there were likely many intermediates along the way. Evolution happens gradually with tiny changes accumulating over generations.
Yeah, it's like trying to draw a clear line on a gradient. There's a difference between the two ends, but exactly where that difference starts is tough to pinpoint.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes, even without a physical barrier, isolation can lead to speciation.
Right.
Dawkins gives the example of mice separated by the vast distance between Madrid and Vladivostok.
Oh.
Over time, those populations will diverge genetically. He also talks about the Ensatina salamanders that form a ring species around California's Central Valley. These salamanders can interbreed with their neighbors along the ring, but the ones at the opposite ends can't.
So it's almost like a spectrum, right? It's like a...
It is, yeah. It's a ring species.
It's fascinating how isolation, whether geographic or otherwise, can drive such dramatic evolutionary changes. It makes me think about how genes must be constantly adapting to their surroundings, both the external environment and the internal environment of other genes within their species. Which one is more important to a gene's success?
Well, Dawkins argues that the internal environment is actually more crucial. The genes within a species are in constant interaction, working together to build a functioning body. Think about the intricate metabolic pathways within a cell. Thousands of genes are involved, each coding for a specific protein, and they all have to work together seamlessly.
Yeah.
It's a bit like a massive collaborative project with each gene playing a specialized role.
I'm picturing a giant, complicated machine with all these interlocking parts. And if even one part malfunctions, the whole thing grinds to a halt.
That's a good analogy. Dawkins even compares it to a complex engineering project like SpaceX, requiring the expertise of thousands of individuals. He calls these groups of cooperating genes cartels.
Cartels, like in organized crime.
It's a provocative comparison. Dawkins uses it to describe groups of genes that have evolved to work together, effectively creating the specialized bodies we see in different species. They're like expert teams, each adapted to a particular lifestyle.
So different species have different gene cartels that are finely tuned to their specific needs. It's like comparing the pit crew of a Formula One race car to the team that builds a skyscraper. Totally different skill sets, but both essential for success.
Exactly. And these gene cartels are constantly being shaped by natural selection. Genes that work well together are more likely to be passed on to future generations. It's like an ongoing audition process where only the most compatible and successful teams get to continue performing.
Okay, so we've got these groups of genes cooperating to build functional organisms.
Right.
But how does that actually play out?
Yeah.
How do we know which genes are good companions and which ones aren't?
Well, Dawkins points to the research of E.B. Ford on lesser yellow underwing moths. Ford studied two forms of the moth, A pale version common on mainland Britain, and a darker version called Curtisii found on certain Scottish islands.
Interesting.
The Curtisi gene, which controls this color difference, is almost always dominant. This means even a single copy will result in a darker moth. But here's where it gets interesting. Ford discovered that other genes called modifiers could influence the Curtisi gene's dominance.
So it's not just about one gene, but about how it interacts with its companions. Kind of like how a single ingredient can taste different depending on what other flavors you combine it with.
That's a great way to think about it. Ford's experiment showed this beautifully. He crossed moths from two islands, Barra and Orkney, both of which had the darker Curtisii form.
Okay.
When these moths were bred, the normally dominant Curtisi gene didn't behave as expected. The offspring showed a much wider spectrum of colors. This is because the modifiers on each island were different. They worked well within their own gene pools, but when mixed, the harmony was disrupted.
So each island developed its own unique set of good companions that allowed the Curtisi gene to thrive. But when you brought those companions together from different islands, it was like they were suddenly speaking different languages.
Exactly.
The communication broke down.
Exactly. Ford's research highlights a crucial point. Good companions are genes that work well together within their specific gene pool. They might not be so good in a different gene pool.
This makes me think about all the different ways genes could be good companions. It's not just about color, but about all the complex traits that make up an organism, right?
Absolutely. Think about predators, for example. Genes for sharp teeth might flourish alongside genes for a short meat-digesting gut. That's a perfect combination for a carnivore. But those same genes wouldn't be good companions in a herbivore, where you need flat teeth and a long gut for processing plants.
So good companions are all about context.
Yes.
It's not just about the gene itself, but about the company it keeps.
Precisely. And just as cooperation is crucial for building a successful organism, sometimes things go wrong. Even good companions can turn bad. This can lead to conflict within the very organism they are meant to build.
That sounds ominous. What happens when those good companions go rogue? That's what we'll be diving into in the next part of our exploration. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're in the middle of unpacking Chapter 12 of The Extended Phenotype by Richard Dawkins, which focuses on the idea of good companions in evolution. Last time we discussed how genes within a species work together like specialized teams to build functional organisms. But what happens when these collaborations break down?
That's a crucial question. Even the most harmonious collaborations can face challenges. Think of it like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Even with talented musicians, a single wrong note can disrupt the entire symphony.
So even within the carefully orchestrated world of genes, there can be conflict.
Absolutely. And one of the most dramatic examples is cancer. Dawkins refers to these rogue cells as bad companions.
Right.
And it's a fitting term when you consider how they disrupt the harmony of the body.
Cancer is such a complex and devastating disease. How does it relate to this idea of good companions gone wrong?
Well, remember how we talked about the development of an embryo as this incredible process of cell division and specialization?
Right.
Each cell meticulously copies its DNA, passing on genetic instructions to its daughter cells. It's like creating a detailed blueprint for building a complex structure.
And just like with any blueprint, if there's an error in the copying process, it can lead to problems in the final structure.
Exactly. These errors are called somatic mutations, changes to the DNA that happen in cells other than the sperm and egg cells.
Okay.
Most of the time, these mutations are harmless, but occasionally a mutation arises that disrupts the normal checks and balances of cell division.
Oh.
Instead of following the blueprint, the cell goes rogue, dividing uncontrollably.
So it's like a construction crew ignoring the architect's plans and just starts building whatever they want without any regard for the overall design.
That's a vivid way to picture it, and that uncontrolled growth is the hallmark of cancer.
Right.
The mutated cell and its descendants keep dividing, relentlessly forming a tumor. But here's where things get even more intriguing. The cancer cells themselves start to evolve within the body.
Wait, evolve. Inside the body. I thought evolution happened over generations, not within a single lifetime.
It's a fascinating phenomenon. Natural selection is actually playing out on a microscopic scale within the tumor. The tumor becomes its own ecosystem, and the cancer cells within it compete for resources and space.
So it's like a microscopic version of survival of the fittest happening right inside the body. The cancer cells that are best at surviving and dividing will outcompete their neighbors, leading to a more aggressive tumor.
Exactly. And this process of rapid evolution can make treating cancer so challenging. It's like trying to hit a moving target. As we develop new therapies, the cancer cells are constantly evolving ways to evade them. It's a sobering example of how the very mechanisms that drive the diversity and complexity of life can also be turned inward with devastating consequences.
It's almost as if evolution has a dark side. This makes me wonder, are there other examples of bad companions in the world of genes besides cancer cells?
There are. Dawkins highlights another type of bad companion called a segregation distorter. Remember how we talked about sexual reproduction and how chromosomes get shuffled and dealt out to create sperm and egg cells? Each gene normally has a 50-50 chance of being passed on like a fair coin toss.
Right. It's like ensuring that everyone gets an equal chance to participate in the genetic lottery.
Exactly. But sometimes a gene arises that cheats the system. This is the segregation distorter. It manipulates the process to increase its own chances of being passed on, even if it offers no benefit to the organism.
So it's like a player in the lottery rigging the system to guarantee they win, even if it means others lose out. Are there real-world examples of these segregation distorters?
There are. Dawkins mentions a driving Y chromosome, a gene on the Y chromosome that skews sperm production towards more male offspring. Instead of the typical 50-50 split between males and females, you might end up with, say, 70% males.
Wow. That could have huge implications for the sex ratio of a population. Are there any potential benefits to this kind of genetic manipulation?
There are potential applications being explored. Dawkins discusses Bill Hamilton's suggestion of using a driving Y chromosome to control populations of the yellow fever mosquito, a dangerous disease vector. By skewing the sex ratio towards males, you could theoretically reduce the overall mosquito population.
That's a fascinating idea, but it also sounds a little bit like playing with fire.
It is. There are significant ecological and ethical considerations to take into account when manipulating the genetic makeup of populations. It's crucial to weigh the potential benefits against the risks. We need to remember that we're dealing with complex systems, and even small changes can have unforeseen consequences.
It makes you appreciate the delicate balance that exists within a species gene pool. We've talked about bad companions and the problems they can cause, but it sounds like the vast majority of genes are actually cooperating for the greater good.
You're absolutely right. Most genes have evolved to work together to contribute to the overall success of the organism. Their own survival depends on it.
So how does this cooperation come about? What compels these genes to work together so effectively, and how do they stay on track? Let's dive into that in the final part of our exploration. Join us next time as we continue to unpack the idea of good companions. Welcome back to our deep dive into Richard Dawkins' Good Companions. We've covered a lot of ground, from exploring how genes cooperate to build these complex organisms to examining what happens when those collaborations go awry. But the big question remains, what makes genes good companions in the first place? What motivates them to work together so effectively?
Yeah, that's the heart of Dawkins' argument. He suggests that the key to understanding genetic cooperation lies in recognizing their shared destiny. All genes within a species rely on the same vehicle, the organism, to carry them into future generations.
So it's a matter of shared self-interest. Like if the organism fails, everyone goes down with the ship.
Precisely. Imagine genes as passengers on a long voyage. They might have their own individual quirks and preferences, but ultimately their fate is tied to the success of the ship.
Right.
If the ship sinks, everyone loses.
That's a powerful analogy. It suggests that even though genes might compete for resources or influence within the body, their long-term survival depends on the overall health and reproductive success of the organism.
Exactly. A gene that disrupts development or hoards resources might gain a temporary advantage, but ultimately it jeopardizes its own chances of being passed on. It's like a short-sighted business strategy that focuses on immediate profits but ignores the long-term sustainability of the company.
So the most successful genes aren't necessarily the most selfish in the narrow sense. They're the ones that contribute to the overall well-being of the organism, even if it means making some compromises along the way.
Precisely. It's a fascinating example of how cooperation can emerge from self-interest. By working together, genes actually enhance their own chances of survival in the long run.
This challenges the traditional view of evolution as a purely competitive struggle, doesn't it? It suggests that cooperation plays a much bigger role than we might have previously thought.
It certainly does. Dawkins argues that this shared destiny is what drives genes to cooperate. They've been shaped by natural selection to work together, contributing their unique skills to the collective enterprise of building a functional organism. It's like a complex ecosystem where different species might compete for food or territory, but the stability of the entire ecosystem is crucial for everyone's survival.
It makes you appreciate the incredible complexity and interconnectedness of life, doesn't it? It's not just about individual genes struggling for dominance. It's about this intricate web of cooperation that makes the whole system work.
It is. It's a humbling realization, and it opens up all sorts of intriguing questions. If genes are constantly evolving to be good companions within their species, what happens when environmental pressures change dramatically? Can these cooperative relationships adapt to rapid changes like the ones we're seeing in the world today?
That's a really thought-provoking question. It suggests that evolution isn't just some distant process that happened in the past. It's happening right now all around us as genes continually adjust their strategies for cooperation and survival.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of continued research and exploration in the field of genetics and evolution. The more we understand about the intricate dance between cooperation and competition within the genome, the more we can appreciate this remarkable tapestry of life.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Richard Dawkins' Good Companions. It's been a fascinating journey into the world of genes and their remarkable ability to cooperate and adapt. Thanks for sending in these thought-provoking excerpts. We hope you'll join us again soon for another deep dive